Let's read Romans 2, beginning in verse 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know His will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Verse 25, for circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So, if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. You may be seated. Well, as I introduced to you last time, Paul is building a case. He began in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17 with the presentation, the introduction of the gospel that he is unashamed of, and what it is, the righteousness poured into humanity by God through the cross. But then, after introducing it, he backs up and he goes all the way back to humanity long before the gospel, long before grace, to the point at which humanity was in a state where the only law that humanity had was conscience, the law of their own heart, the law of their own mind. That's beginning in verse 18, where he begins to describe the problem. It's that idea that before we can really appreciate the good news that is the gospel, we have to understand the bad news. He goes back and he presents the bad news. He presents the reality that because of the unrighteousness of man, God is pouring out His wrath. And he begins to describe that situation with man before grace, before the law, that is, before the giving of the Ten Commandments and what came after that, when man was simply and only guided by their conscience, and however God would speak to that individual directly. And so he's brought us through some examples, some realities that are brought to bear, and he talks about how even man in that place of having only the conscience is still culpable for certain things, right? He said that the creation around and the conscience within leaves a man or woman in that place without knowing the law, without Scripture, without grace, realizing that there is a God and that He is worthy of honor and worship. And he says, therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. You have a law written on your own hearts. And then he continues and he talks about in verses 12 through 16 how that law of conscience in some ways makes the individual without the law better off than the individual with the law. That in some ways the Greek or Gentile who only has the conscience is better off than the Jew who has the law, because with greater understanding comes greater responsibility, right? And then he says in verse 17, but if you call yourself a Jew. And he shifts. And in shifting, what I believe Paul is doing is he's now moving from the idea of what the reality is for humanity with only conscience to what the reality is with humanity under the law. And of course, again, he's building the case. He's step by step taking us through the process of humanity, going from the place of only conscience to being under the law, and ultimately presenting the gospel as humanity under grace, the gospel. In the process, he uses or brings to light, brings to the surface something that is very prominent in human nature. It's a word we're all familiar with. It's hypocrisy. That's what he talks about here. He talks about hypocrisy, all these examples of you say you're this, that, and the other thing, but you do this, the opposite. That's a hypocrite. And hypocrisy is a unique attribute of humanity, isn't it? Think about it. No one proudly proclaims their hypocrisy. I am a hypocrite. Nobody says that. Whereas the fornication or sexual sin is often proudly flaunted in a variety of ways, in a variety of settings. Stealing can even be seen in the world as being noble. Robin Hood, another version of that, is coming out soon. Homosexuality is celebrated with gay pride, but there's no hypocrite pride day. No movie where the hypocrite is the hero. Hypocrisy is not flaunted like fornication. But we all have it. And that's what I ultimately want to get to is the presence of hypocrisy in our own lives, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever. We all have it. It's central to what it means to be human as believers who have the Spirit in us, who have been regenerated. It's part of our flesh. It's common, but it's devastating. Devastating to reputation, devastating to relationships, and certainly devastating to the work of the gospel. So where does it come from? That is a question that we have to answer. As we consider, and if you have an outline, you can see the title of my message, Cutting Out Hypocrisy. As we consider how we do that, we have some great principles here that Paul gives us in the context of continuing this case that he's building for grace. And so, we begin with the fruit of hypocrisy. Apparently, my house isn't the only place, your house, where hypocrisy rears its ugly head. The church in Rome had it too. Remember, that's who this letter is written to, right? Apparently they had hypocrisy too, which in this case in particular is claiming to be someone you're not. That's what Tozer defines hypocrisy as, A.W. Tozer. What is hypocrisy, he asks? Hypocrisy is an old Greek word used for an actor on stage, somebody who pretended to be what he or she was not. A hypocrite, he concludes, is an actor, somebody who is playing a part. And for these who received this letter, it seems to me that they were those who were playing the part of being a Jew. They were claiming to be under the law. He says, but if you call yourself a Jew, who is the you calling themselves a Jew? Who is that? You. But if you call yourself a Jew, it could be that he's talking to Jews. It could be that he's talking to Messianic Jews, those who have come to believe in Jesus as their Messiah, like 3,000 did that first day of Pentecost, right? It could be that he's talking to them, but there's another possibility, and to me, it seems to fit better, and that is that I believe he's talking to, because of his phrasing, you call yourself a Jew, or another way of translating it, that is, you are called a Jew. It seems to intimate that they aren't really, but they're calling themselves that, or allowing themselves to be called. I believe these are probably Gentile Christians who were evangelized by believing Jews. Some of those who came to believe in Yeshua as their Messiah after Pentecost. Now, we think that might be that odd. For us now, we can't imagine that if we came to Christ that we would consider ourselves to be Jews. That doesn't make sense, because we now are living hundreds and hundreds of years after the fullness of what Jesus revealed to Paul has taken root. But at this point, Paul hadn't even been to Rome yet. And Peter's dream, remember in Acts 10 where it was revealed to Peter that the Gentiles would be brought in and they wouldn't be unclean anymore, that God was opening the door to the Gentiles. That had been revealed to Peter, but not that the Gentiles wouldn't have to do everything else that he did as a Jewish believer. That hadn't been revealed to Peter. The Jerusalem Council had met in Acts 15 by this point, but it was Paul and Barnabas who were the ones sent out to relieve the Gentiles of all the extra things that the law required. And so, without the clear understanding that only Paul had, and that is that Christianity was not Judaism 2.0, right? That Christianity wasn't just adding on to what God had already done, but completely replacing it. It would make sense that if everyone who was preaching the gospel to them, who was telling them about Jesus, that Jesus was a Jew, the Messiah was a Jew, all these believers were Jews, then why wouldn't we become Jews? And certainly we would allow people to consider us Jews. And so Paul says, but you consider. And in Galatians 5:2, we see that this reality was swirling around in the early church. That they were not only accepting the title of Jew, but they were even calling themselves, pursuing the most plain identifying mark of Judaism, which was what? Circumcision. In Galatians 5:2, he says, look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. And he rebukes the Galatian church for returning back to the yoke of slavery that is the law. And so I believe that in large part, having never been to Rome, having not been the one that planted the church in Rome, part of his purpose in writing this letter to the Romans is to achieve the same thing that he was achieving in the Galatian church, to make sure they understand what Christianity is. That it's not just an addition to Judaism. It's a whole new thing. And so, these people that had put themselves under the law, that were considering themselves Jews, these were probably new believers, Gentile believers, who were identifying with all the beliefs and rites and customs of Israel's Mosaic and prophetic tradition. That's how Schurer, the commentator, defines Jew. And then, what I believe makes it even more clear that this is the case, Paul, in what seems to me as sarcasm and hyperbole, hammers away at what exactly it means to be a Jew. And really, his point, I believe, in what he says here in 17 through 24, is not telling them you're hypocrites and you need to get it together. It's showing them by their hypocrisy that they're not even close to measuring up to the standard that God requires of those who would truly be Jews. And so he says, what does he say? You call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Do you hear the sarcasm? Do you see what Paul is doing? I've added my own emphasis to bring out what I believe his point is. That this is what the Jews claimed to do. This is what they claimed to be. This is who they are. And yet you are not these things. You've put a title upon yourself. You've claimed to be under the law, but you're living as though the law doesn't apply to you. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Answer, no, you don't. While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? And then he answers the questions. You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. This reality that hypocrisy produces blasphemy of the world is ultimately what Paul emphasizes as he completes this picture of what the reality is. And so this is just your basic run-of-the-mill hypocrisy. The people claiming to be Jews, according to Paul, were not at all doing the things that they claimed that they should be doing, that the law would prescribe for them to do. And so that's the fruit of hypocrisy. That's the evidence of it, but its root is much deeper. And Paul then goes on to reveal the root of hypocrisy, and that is superficial transformation. Superficial transformation, the effect only being surface and not going all the way to the heart. And to point out this root of hypocrisy, Paul uses one of the most powerful examples of it, and that is the reality concerning circumcision. Nothing identified a Jew like circumcision did. I think a lot of you know that. But for those of you who don't, certainly we read about it from the very beginning of the scriptures in the book of Genesis. Genesis 17, 9 through 14, we read that circumcision, the physical cutting off of the foreskin of every male, was to be the sign of the covenant between Abraham, the father of all who believe, and God. The covenant that God made with Abraham, that through his offspring, all the nations of the world would be blessed, all the people. Ultimately, that would be fulfilled in Christ and in the church. But that was prescribed. He says, every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. 8 days old, every male was to be circumcised. Verse 14 of Genesis 17 says, any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And I just have to tell you now, I'm just going to get it out there. You are going to hear the word circumcision a lot today. Okay, so let's just settle into that reality. Paul is going to mention it 10 times in this passage, and I am going to say it many more. So just kind of prepare yourselves. This whole idea of circumcision became even more important after the Jews returned from exile, where we read during the period of the Maccabean struggle, that was in like the 200 BC time frame, circumcision assumed, and this is Robert Jewett writing, he's a scholar, a historian, it assumed a crucial role as a mark of Jewish national distinctiveness, an essential expression of the national religion. The Hasmoneans, which were a particular family in leadership in Israel during the same period, decreed that Gentiles could remain within the territory of Israel only so long as they had themselves circumcised and were willing to observe the laws of the Jews. Marriages with uncircumcised partners were forbidden because Gentiles bring shame and defilement. They even considered the angels, the good angels, to have been created circumcised, and the evil ones having not been circumcised. And so this was the reality swirling around as even we come to the New Testament period, the time of the writing of Paul. Certainly, circumcision was still a big deal. And yet, as Paul points out, it had become something other than what God intended. And as we consider what God intended for this to be, what we'll find out is that there is very much a New Testament reality. There is very much principles for our life that have always existed with God and his chosen people. This physical only, this superficial reality about circumcision was not what Jehovah intended. Even all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy, we read about what God expects. And in Deuteronomy 10, after talking about how God requires them to fear the Lord, to walk in his ways, to love him, to serve him with all their heart and soul, and to keep his commandments. He does bring up circumcision, but listen to what he says. Verse 16 of Deuteronomy 10. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart. The foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. You see, for the Jew, the real, the true Jew, physical circumcision was always to be partnered with spiritual circumcision. The circumcision of the heart. That is why Paul writes in verse 28 of chapter 2 of Romans, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly. And circumcision is a matter of the heart, and it still is. By the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. And what I've done is I have sought to clarify what Paul is saying in this passage, in verses 25 through 29. I've put them in a format that we can put on the screen, and I've added some adjectives to each of the times that Paul mentions the word circumcision. And I believe as we read through this, it actually becomes pretty clear what he is saying. So let's read this with me. Just follow along as I read. For physical circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your physical circumcision becomes spiritual uncircumcision. So if a man who is physically uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his physical uncircumcision be regarded as spiritual circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and physical circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is true circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and true circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. And this is where we get the idea that the word Jew actually means one who loves God. One who loves God, which is a matter of the heart. And certainly physical circumcision was required. It was important. Every male 8 days old was to get circumcised, but its purpose was like baptism. And if you've been baptized, especially here, then you know every time we baptize someone, we always say, look, it's important you understand baptism in and of itself accomplishes nothing. Zero, zilch. There is no power. There is nothing about baptism in and of itself that does anything. It is simply a sign, an indicator, an act of obedience based upon something that has happened in your own heart. And so circumcision was to be a sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham. So, I hope that helps. You can see, I believe, more clearly what Paul is saying. And it's summarized in that final 2 verses, or actually in the beginning, verse 25, the fact that there's no benefit from physical circumcision. Physical circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law, which means that if you don't, it is of no benefit. And in addition to that, Paul is saying there is no benefit in becoming a Jew. There's no benefit. If what you see as becoming a Jew is that you become circumcised, that you put yourself under this body of law that the Jews had, you'd be better off just to stay as you are as a Gentile. You'd be better off just to have your conscience and allow that to be your guide, because as he said earlier on in chapter 2, that at least will excuse you of some things. But once you have the law, once you know everything, if you don't follow everything, then you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So the take home is this: circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And that person's praise is not from man. It's not an outward thing. It's not a visible, physical thing, but from God. So as we consider applying this to our own lives, I want to take verse 29 and that idea that circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit. And I want to combine that with James chapter 2. Last week we looked at another passage in James chapter 4:17. Now I want to look at James 2:14 through 17, where we see a Jew, Messianic Jew, James, the brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus, described to the believers something that I believe is analogous for us. He says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works?" Does that sound familiar? It sounds a lot like what we just read. Physical circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law. What good is it if someone says he has faith? That's like physical circumcision. You claim to have faith, but you don't have works. Can that claimed faith save you? Save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. It is a said faith, not a real faith. It is a dead faith and not a living faith. And it is, in the case of those of us who have come to Christ, it is hypocrisy, as we'll see. Not all said faith is real faith. Like circumcision, there is true faith and there is phony faith. And so, number one, true faith, that which we should be seeking to have, begins with spiritual circumcision. Spiritual circumcision. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? What is the faith that saves? What is real faith? Real faith is that which has a changed life accompanying it. And I take you back to Romans chapter 2, verse 29. This reality that Paul describes in verse 29 is, for us, a reality that very much applies to our life as faith. He says, circumcision is a matter of the heart. True faith, that is that which begins with spiritual circumcision, is a matter of the heart. It begins with heart surgery. Heart surgery, not a skin graft. It isn't a superficial outward change. You can't just say that you have faith. You can't just start to act like those that you see who call themselves Christians and say, well, I'm doing what they do, I'm going where they go, I'm saying what they say, and therefore I am of faith. I am a Christian. James would say, no, you're not. You're not. Because that reality that begins in the heart, the circumcision, spiritual circumcision, produces a change from within that causes the outward change to take place. To just do the things that Christians do without the inner heart change, without it being a matter of obedience to God, is like getting physically circumcised but not obeying the law. Do you see the connection? It's heart surgery, not a skin graft. It's carried out by grace, not by works. Again, he says, by the Spirit. It is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. That is the letter of the law. By the Spirit, not by the letter of the law. And that means, with that contrast, that it's carried out by grace, not by works. By grace, not by works. It's an act of God. By belief. By a willingness, a decision to obey God from your heart. And it's a major shift. As God comes in and He circumcises our hearts, He marks us. He puts a sign of His covenant within us. That is the Holy Spirit. A dramatic change takes place. And we shift from pleasing man, pleasing ourselves, to wanting to please God. All of a sudden we find conviction that wasn't there. The evidence of this spiritual circumcision is a new sensitivity, a new allegiance, a new master. And so I begin there because although I know most of you know the gospel, most of you know the reality that real faith begins by receiving the gift of God through Christ. It begins with heart surgery. It is a work of His grace, and it is a major shift. Some of you here today, some of you may be listening to this, haven't allowed that to take place. You don't have true faith because you haven't been spiritually circumcised. You haven't allowed God to come in and to mark you as His. You haven't received and decided to follow Him. True faith begins there. But it doesn't end there. And the reality is that James' words, Paul's words, they apply to those of us who have been circumcised of heart, who have been born again. Listen, this is where the hypocrisy becomes very relevant to us. You then, he says, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? So also, James said, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And what I have recognized in my own heart, in the heart of other believers, is this reality. That we could have a faith that saves us. We could have a faith that redeems us. We could be circumcised in heart, but be living hypocritically in our lives. We could be those that Paul would speak to directly and say to you, to me, you then, you who teach others, you who talk about the truths of God, you who claim the scriptures, you who call yourself a Christian, you who say that Jesus is your master, do you not say that to yourself? You hypocrite. And it is because of this that we must recognize that a circumcised heart still needs work, that it must be shepherded out of hypocrisy. That hypocrisy is so natural and so deeply rooted and so ingrained that we must consistently, throughout the sanctifying process of our lives, make sure that our hearts are being shepherded. And that's the element of this passage that for application is really important that we don't miss. Paul is being sarcastic about referencing all the things that the Jews, that those who were putting themselves under the law claimed to do, that what was included in this, if you're going to be called a Jew, it's all of these things, but you don't do them. You're a hypocrite. But the reality is, as you look at the list, relying on the law, let's call that the scripture. Boasting in God, let's call that calling Him our Father. Knowing His will. We claim to do that. We approve what is excellent. That is, aren't we the ones who tell the world what's right and wrong? Don't we have that? Aren't we the ones that God's called to be a guide to the blind, light to those in darkness, instructors of the foolish and the disciples of children and those who are young, bringing them up in the faith? Isn't that who we're supposed to be in every single way? Yes. Yes. And yet the reality is what Spurgeon wrote, he who is true will sometimes suspect himself of falsehood. And he who is false will wrap himself up in a constant confidence of his own sincerity. Oh, it's so easy. Let me read it again. He who is true will sometimes suspect himself of falsehood. And he who is false will wrap himself up in a constant confidence of his own sincerity. How easy it is to wrap ourselves up in a blind, deceived confidence in our own goodness. I'm a Christian. You decry the horrific divorce rate in the world and in the church. You speak out about marriage and its sacred nature, how important it is to God. And yet you do nothing, absolutely nothing, daily and weekly to work on the marriage that God's given you. Hypocrisy. You claim to be the source of the truth about marriage. You claim to know that it is this incredible thing God has created, but you do nothing to invest in and to develop your own. For years, I was married and marrying people and counseling people as a pastor, and yet doing very little to really develop, to really work on my own marriage. I was a hypocrite. And even more recently, even as that in some ways improved, more recently coming to the realization that I was still not doing the things that should be done if I really believe that marriage is what Scripture says that it is. If I really believe that I am to care for my wife like Jesus cares for the church. And so recently, having that brought to our attention, Kari and I began to be much more intentional. And we have brought others around, Roy and Dora, helping us develop and work on our own marriage, to see it go beyond where it is, to become even more what God intends it to be, this perfect example of the relationship between Christ and the church. Trying to cut out the hypocrisy from my own life. You will readily tell someone and claim that this book is the Word of God. This is divinely inspired, every word. And you'll speak about the verbal plenary of it and how it's incredible, this revelation from outside, and yet you won't read it as if it is. And if you read it, you won't obey it. You won't do what it says. What is that? It's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. It's physical circumcision without circumcision of the heart, without allowing it to come in and do the work that it is to do in you. As parents, we are so easily given over to judging other parents, looking down upon other parents, other people's children, judging and comparing and being critical in our own hearts. And then we go home and we don't preach the gospel to our own kids at all. We don't live the gospel out in front of our own children. We might not do those things that we look down upon others for doing. We go home and we don't do the most important thing. I mean, the one thing we're to do is to raise our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That's the main thing. Everything else is secondary, and yet we're not doing that. We're hypocrites. And recently, just a couple days ago, I did this with my own son. I got really angry at him. You know why? Because he got really angry and said something to his mom that he shouldn't have said. It was wrong. It wasn't good. But neither was what I did. And as I'm going upstairs after grabbing him and sending him up, and I'm walking up the stairs and I'm going, oh man, this is ridiculous. The first thing I had to do was sit down before my son and say, son, look, what you did is wrong, but I have to say something to you first. What I did was wrong. Forgive me for getting angry at you getting angry. Do you see how insidious it is? Do you see how easily we accommodate, we allow hypocrisy into our own lives? It's so easy. We talk about how wrong it is for individuals to live off government assistance. This is a big thing in New England. We're live free or die. But then we go and trust in a different replacement for God and what He has intended for us to depend on. And we're hypocrites. We set our standard of living by something we would do, we like rather than what God would like. We're stingy with our money rather than being generous. These are just a few examples of how we so easily give ourselves over to exactly what Paul is talking about here. As far as I see it, there's two ways out of this scenario. One of them is to just stop paying attention to others. Right? Just completely put blinders on, don't even consider what anybody else is doing. And therefore you won't judge them, right? You won't teach them, you won't instruct them. Just don't say anything, don't look around, don't do anything. And then you're not being a hypocrite. That's not a good option. We are to be teaching. We are to be instructing. We are to be living lives together as a community, helping one another. We are to observe. Paul tells us, Jesus tells us, yeah, we're to take the log out of our own eye first, but then we are to help those remove the speck from their eye, others. So just completely disconnecting from everybody, that's not the option. So what is? What is the solution? It is to start shepherding your heart away from hypocrisy. And here's the thing, you can't actually shepherd your own heart. You're too good at deceiving yourself. You need others to help. You need others to be close enough that at least in those moments of clarity and sanity when you go, like me, man, I need help, that you actually get help. You actually seek someone out and you say, would you please help shepherd my heart? Because I'm a hypocrite, because I'm struggling with this, because I don't do what I know that I ought to do. And in this particular way right now, I see the hypocrisy that I am living in, and I don't want to live in it anymore. Help shepherd my heart out of this hypocrisy into the place of faithfulness, into the place of strength. For this is the will of God, right? Your sanctification, your growth, your heart continuing to be shepherded more and more out of claiming one thing while living as something else.